Have you ever wondered what's really behind the promise God made to David and his lineage? The hidden truth about this covenant goes far beyond a simple earthly throne. In today's video, we're going to reveal how this promise shaped Israel's destiny, passed through generations of kings, faced crises, and ultimately found its fulfillment in Jesus Christ. It's not just about a temporary reign, but an eternal promise that still impacts humanity today. If you've heard of David and the Kingdom of Israel, get ready to uncover details you may have never noticed. We're going to explore how this covenant pointed to something far greater than a physical kingdom. It was connected to the destiny of the Messiah. Stay with us until the end to understand how this transformative promise can offer fresh perspectives for your own life. The covenant God made with David was one of the most significant moments in both his life and the reign of Israel. While David was settling into his rule and enjoying a time of peace, God, through the prophet Nathan, delivered a message that would change everything. He promised David that his lineage would be established forever, and from his descendants would come an eternal kingdom. This promise wasn't just about a continued dynasty. It carried deep spiritual implications. David wouldn't just rule Israel, his house would become the center of the messianic promise. In the historical context, this promise gave David a spiritual assurance beyond what he could have imagined. As God's chosen one, he understood that his reign wasn't just a temporary phase in Israel's political scene, but part of a larger divine plan. David, who had started as a shepherd and risen to become Israel's greatest king, was now being guaranteed that his throne would be eternal. This covenant demonstrated God's love and faithfulness to the people of Israel, reaffirming that the future was securely in his hands. The moment Nathan delivered this prophecy was a turning point for David. Having achieved so many victories and united the tribes of Israel, he now received a promise that transcended time. God assured him that even after his death, his son would continue on the throne, and eventually, this lineage would culminate in an eternal kingdom. For David, this wasn't just an honor, it was a confirmation that his walk of faith had not been in vain. The responsibility of being the patriarch of a lineage that would bring salvation to the world weighed heavily on him, but he accepted it with humility. This covenant wasn't limited to its immediate historical context. It carried with it an expectation of redemption and restoration that would be passed down through generations. David knew that this promise wasn't just for him, but for all who would come after him. It was a pact that involved not just the political continuity of Israel, but also the spiritual destiny of humanity. David's reign was being established on eternal foundations, and his lineage would bring forth the Messiah, the king who would reign forever. This promise marked the beginning of a new chapter in Israel's history. David, the man after God's own heart, now had the assurance that his throne would be eternal. The covenant between God and David was a symbol of divine faithfulness, and David, filled with gratitude and reverence, recognized the greatness of this promise. But this was just the first part of a story that would continue to unfold over the centuries. God's promise that David's descendants would continue to rule Israel was fulfilled through his lineage. The first and most notable was his son Solomon, who not only inherited the throne, but was also tasked with building the temple in Jerusalem, ushering in a new era of worship to God. Under Solomon's rule, Israel experienced great prosperity and peace. However, over the generations, David's lineage would face both triumphs and crises. Each king of the house of David carried the weight of this divine covenant, knowing that their leadership had profound spiritual and historical significance. But this faithfulness to the covenant wasn't always upheld in exemplary ways. Many of David's descendants, especially those who ruled over Judah, struggled with crises of faith and periods of disobedience. Kings like Rehoboam and Manasseh led the people away from God, which brought severe consequences, including invasions and destruction. Yet God's promise remained. Even in dark times, faithful kings like Hezekiah and Josiah emerged to restore worship to the Lord and reinforce trust in the covenant. These leaders were reminders that, even in times of crisis, God's faithfulness never wavers. Over the centuries, David's lineage continued to rule in Judah, even when the northern kingdom of Israel fell to the Assyrians. The Davidic line was preserved, symbolizing the hope that David's throne would remain. However, Judah's fate eventually mirrored that of Israel. When Jerusalem fell and the people were taken into Babylonian exile, it seemed as though God's promise was on the verge of collapse. The throne was empty, and the people were scattered. Yet even in this, hope in the promise of an eternal king remained, kept alive by the prophet's words and the people's faith. The story of the kings of Israel and Judah, descendants of David, is one of both triumph and downfall, faithfulness and disobedience. Yet, through it all, God preserved David's line. Even amid Jerusalem's fall, this lineage carried the messianic hope of a king who would bring redemption, not just to Israel, but to the entire world. Despite human failure, God's promise was unbreakable. Every king, flawed as they may have been, was part of a greater plan that would be revealed in time. Even after the kingdom fell and the people were exiled, the hope in David's lineage never died out. The people of Israel continued to wait for the full realization of God's promise, a king who would restore Israel's glory and rule with justice and righteousness. This messianic longing kept the flame of faith alive, paving the way for the final fulfillment of the divine covenant. After the fall of Israel and Judah and the ensuing Babylonian exile, the people of Israel entered a time of deep uncertainty. However, in the midst of the chaos, a flicker of hope remained, the promise that a descendant of David would reign eternally. Prophets began to speak of a king who would bring lasting justice and peace, someone who would restore David's throne and deliver the people. Prophets like Isaiah declared that a branch would emerge from the root of Jesse, and this king would usher in a kingdom of righteousness where even the wolf and the lamb would live in harmony. It was a vision that went beyond politics and temporary struggles, pointing to something eternal. This messianic hope only grew stronger with time. The people who had suffered invasions, exiles, and foreign domination longed for a liberator who wouldn't just restore Israel politically, but also bring spiritual peace and salvation. The prophecies pointed to a descendant of David who would rule not only Israel but all nations. The Messiah would be the promised king, the one who would restore everything that was lost. Even in times of great suffering, this promise was a beacon of hope. Books like Jeremiah and Ezekiel reinforced the promise of the eternal king. Ezekiel, for example, spoke of a shepherd who would care for the people of Israel, bringing unity and prosperity. This messianic figure wouldn't be just a ruler but a true shepherd, guiding the people with love and justice. Even when Jerusalem was destroyed and the people were exiled, the promise of God through the prophets kept alive the faith in the fulfillment of the covenant with David. What seemed lost would be restored in great glory. The messianic hope was the thread that kept Israel's identity and faith intact through centuries of exile and foreign occupation. Even when earthly kings failed, the people knew that God's promise wouldn't. They awaited the Anointed One, the descendant of David who would bring redemption, not only to Israel, but to the entire world. The prophecies made it clear that this king would be unlike any other. He would bring an eternal kingdom of peace where God himself would reign through his chosen one. As the centuries passed, the expectation for the Messiah's coming only intensified. The words of the prophets were repeated and cherished with anticipation. Even under the rule of empires like Babylon, Persia, and Rome, the people of Israel waited for the moment when the promised king would rise, restoring David's throne and fulfilling the eternal covenant God had made with his servant. The hope was alive, and the promise was on the verge of being fulfilled. The ultimate fulfillment of God's promise to David came in the person of Jesus Christ, a direct descendant of the Davidic line. Born in Bethlehem, the city of David, Jesus was recognized from the beginning as the promised Messiah. His birth was celebrated by shepherds and wise men, and he was proclaimed King of the Jews. The genealogy of Jesus, as recorded in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke, directly traces back to David, showing that he was the rightful heir to the promise. Jesus didn't come just to restore the physical throne of Israel, but to establish a spiritual kingdom that would transcend all earthly boundaries. Jesus represented the complete fulfillment of the promise of an eternal king. Unlike the earthly kings who failed and fell, his reign would be eternal and perfect. He brought not only the hope of a restored kingdom, but the promise of a new covenant between God and humanity. Jesus established a kingdom built on justice, love, and reconciliation, and his sacrifice on the cross was the climax of the promised redemption. Through him, David's lineage found its ultimate purpose, a king who reigns forever, bringing salvation to all. Jesus' ministry revealed what it truly meant to be the Messianic King. He healed the sick, raised the dead, and proclaimed the coming of God's kingdom. But unlike what many expected, he didn't come to conquer with swords and armies, but with the power of love and forgiveness. His throne wasn't made of gold and precious stones. It was raised on the cross, where he secured victory over sin and death. Jesus reigned not through earthly power, but through humility and sacrifice, fulfilling the prophecies of an eternal kingdom. After his resurrection, Jesus was exalted to the right hand of God, and he now reigns over a kingdom that is not of this world. The fulfillment of God's promise to David was realized on a scale far greater than anyone could have imagined. Jesus didn't just restore Israel, he opened the doors of God's kingdom to all nations. His reign is eternal, and he continues to rule over the hearts and lives of those who follow him. The covenant God made with David found its perfect fulfillment in Christ, the King of Kings, whose kingdom will never end. God's covenant with David was more than just a promise of earthly succession. It was a divine plan to redeem humanity through a descendant who would reign forever. In Jesus Christ, the promise was fulfilled, and his kingdom is present today, both in heaven and on earth, extending to all who recognize him as the promised king. Thus, David's lineage lives on, not in thrones of stone, but in a heavenly throne that reigns forever. Now that you know the hidden truth behind God's covenant with David, the question is, how does this impact your life? The promise that began with David culminated in Jesus Christ, the eternal King who not only reigns in heaven but also offers redemption and transformation to everyone. Just as David trusted in God's faithfulness, you can trust that this promise extends to today, bringing hope, direction, and purpose. So how will this covenant influence your choices and your faith? Share in the comments what impacted you most in this journey through God's promise. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell to keep learning about these deep, eternal truths that can transform your life.